Very happy to be here today. And unfortunately, Anita's not here today, but we include her in bit form, so she'll be within the ones and zeros spirit. So a little bit of a build on the intro. We've been working together with technology and art for many years, almost 20 years now, of just this idea of like, how can we take cold technology and infuse it with art and just try to give a little bit of life into it. And so that's sort of been our philosophy. And then with that philosophy, we're like, all right, well, let's see how we can do that in business. And before we had the Department of New Realities, we had a company called Champagne Valentine, and we were specializing in interactive and doing art for brands and installations and digital this and that all over the place. And so that was sort of like we built a lot of relationships that way that have extended into something more mature and more formal and more sophisticated for us called the Department of New Realities, which sits inside of Wieden+Kennedy, Amsterdam. And we've been there for 2.5 years now. And it's been very fruitful, very good for us to be within like the catership of the mothership of running these kind of ambitions of technology and art. But it wasn't always that situation. We come from very Gothic backgrounds, kind of isolated into doing goth dances underneath bridges in Australia. Well, that's Anita, but I relate to it. I'm more the Hell USA part of the whole thing. And, but it was always just, we were in environments where we isolated ourselves from like the traditions of suburban realities and beach realities and started thinking about sort of like other worlds that we could go to and fabricate. And so we're always like kind of thinking about like what kind of fantasies do we want to create by merging technology and art. And this was sort of like a way for us to escape the mundane. And some of our earlier work was under the guise of like, all right, well, what can we do with old video game engines? Before Unreal was massively popular for VR and AR like it is now. It used to be this, sort of like an alien video game where you'd run and shoot up characters, and then it would be quite rare and quite weird to be able to like hijack it and have some cyber fembot be the main character and then have psychedelic art infuse a certain like fairy tale fantasy into that kind of video game aesthetic. And so that was some of our earlier kind of ambitions, was like, how can we sort of like bring a certain soul into that? And also thinking about intimate internet experiences, very different than Tinder and Bumble and these things now, but just, it was more the idea of creating artwork as it's intended to be seen in a website format. So it was a kind of an early net art mentality of how can we take art out of the gallery and museum context and allow people to experience artwork as it's intended to be seen in the comfort of their own privacy and home. And there was a certain kind of connection that we could make with the machine with this idea of net art. And also thinking about what we're calling DOS dating interfaces, but really what that is like using the language and the aesthetic of programming, of web culture, of interactive culture, all of these things, but bringing it into a pop music formula. And so a lot of times we see this kind of like consistent culture of what we work in being brought into the mainstream, and we're really interested in that, of how we can like basically make things that have like been like nerdy or pulled back, like to make it kind of cool and popular and sexy. And so that's always been like a way that we're sort of infusing what we're interested in, but more into the mainstream world. And then also thinking about, after we die, like getting a little bit esoteric, getting a little bit future thinking, and thinking about all of the digital data that we have, everything that we're contributing to Facebook, that we're uploading to Instagram, all of these things, like all of these things that are basically data of how we act and are, what happens to that after we die? And so we think about afterlife destinations. So we're kind of like thinking about when we don't have our bodies, when we're buried under the ground or cremated, what can we do with that data? So that's always another theme that we're kind of interested in exploring. And then making sure that that data is used in a way that can be designed and curated for something healthy or not. I mean, it can be hellish or it can be positive. So we're just kind of like, depending on the scenario, we're like, all right, how do we want to take all of these experiences and set ourselves up for a spa vacation in the future after we die? And then also bringing back the kind of avatars, just being like, all right, well, how can we commoditize and commercialize digital data and use these kind of avatar culture for something like a lookbook and fashion and things like that. So all of these kind of things follow a consistent thread, which goes underneath the moodiness stemming from our early goth days. But a lot of times we're trying to like infuse like sort of hyper real, absurdity, psychedelic, anti-design, a certain punk attitude. And all of this is just giving the technology a soul and a grittiness, and that's really important for us, is to like almost by choice make things like make the wrong decision, make it feel at least real, because that's more important to us than following formula. And so we started seeing all of these realities, and some of them great, some of them not so great, and we like the idea of dystopia, we like the idea of esoteric future, but there's infinite possibilities. Like there's a whole spectrum that we can play with and deal with, and all of this is to help redefine the future's landscape. And we just want to make something new. So we're not working with references a lot. We're just trying to kind of take big leaps and think about how the future is going to be. And at the Department of New Realities, like we're reflecting that, and we're reflecting what's happening in tech culture, and with whether it's a new VR headset or some newest augmented reality approach, and all of these things, we're not fixated on specific devices. We're fixated on the idea of new technology and how we can make experiences that people haven't had before, and infusing it with our sort of like our philosophy and art to give that new technology that we don't even know what it is yet a certain personality. And all of the projects, the way that we get there and that we approach it is we always start with speculative fiction visions. And that's the idea that we're just like, all right, let's come up with a concept. Let's come up with almost like look into the crystal ball and be like, how can we imagine a future scenario within certain themes? And what can we do to explore that? So this is an example of us being like, all right, maybe in the future there'll be a certain kind of like a health approach for how robotics can help us get into like transient meditative states and almost like bring in a spiritual side to robotics. And that's not happening right now, but it could. And so we start by making an Instagram post and posting something like this online, asking these questions, laying down some topics and framework for what that could be, and then it ends up turning into something. And so now we're developing these pods that are fully sensorial, kind of little coffins that you go into, where we can control the smell inside of it, we can control haptics, we can control just an overall sensorial environment, and use that for a certain health benefit. So that's all inspired from this approach of robotics taking care of us and going into something real. Or thinking about, this is a description for CryptoKitties, and I'll read it out to you. A CryptoKitty daycare, which was inspired by a future where we have to clean out our cat litter bank accounts to keep our digital assets groomed and profitable. So the whole idea of that is like, how can we deal with something like currency, in this case, cryptocurrency, but almost give it a personality so that you have to take care of the money, that you have an actual emotional attachment to something that has monetary value. And so that's putting this in a whole other like wild spectrum of like, all right, what kind of art can we deal with the crypto world? And so that's leading into projects in Vancouver with that. And also all of these speculative kind of fiction thinking, it also leads into client desires and client briefs within traditional advertising structures. And so sometimes this kind of stuff that we're doing can be used in a way that is giving us actual commercial briefs for doing interesting advertising work. And this is an example of how an apocalyptic speculation turned into a Corona project. So like how we would imagine the future of Amsterdam to be in fire and brimstone and like a hellish kind of environment. Hopefully not, but maybe. And how that turned into something very commercial for Corona. And this is a project called Bitmap Banshees, and the whole idea is that we're in a familiar environment. We're on the canals of the Herringgrot and the beautiful Dutch architecture around, but it's has a layer of sort of horror and hell that we found quite interesting. And what we did is we hacked together an old exercise bike, and with that exercise bike, we added fan, also known as a wind machine, easier for selling, and used that to create the sensation of really biking down the canal. And all of these elements that we had, and we had haptics, we had wind, we had just a full immersion with VR. We had the exercise component of the bike, so you're physically kind of feeling engaged with the whole thing. All of this sparked the interest of Corona when they came in, and they're like, oh, you're using all of the elements to simulate certain realities, and we have them here trying it out. And so we could see that
All right, oh my God. Do it, my fucking carrots. Do it.
So there's something about that was really interesting, and they came to us and they're like, yeah, we want a VR experience that touches all the senses like you have, but you make it less like horrifying. And so it still had value in terms of getting a bigger, less, horror freak show kind of a project out the door. And so the goal from their brief was like, all right, how can we transport people to another paradise, to another reality, but still have the same haptics, same ability to touch and smell and feel this environment. And so we came up with making a synthetic nature, which is obviously nobody wants to be in a synthetic nature if they can be in real nature, but there's a lot of cases where you can't access nature like that. So in Mexico City, for example, it's not so easy just to like jump out into a full lush jungle, and that's where we built this project. And so we wanted to make sure that people could feel the connection and benefits of nature without having to go there. And because if we don't have at least simulated nature, lack of nature is very bad for us, and it makes people crazy and hostile and gives them like a certain kind of anxiety. And so I'll show the video in the next slide, but the whole idea of this was that everybody would enter into a hacienda, like a giant, beautiful Mexico City building, and the entry was all decorated like almost like a Berlin club, so like just like harsh techno, blue lighting, just like a very cold, dark, good party atmosphere. And then from there, you would be guided by these actresses and actors that would pull you into an old vending machine, and then you'd go into the vending machine, and then you'd be strapped onto a VR headset and walk around this immersive simulation of nature where you could touch and feel everything, and then you'd come out and you'd be in a tropical world. So it was just showing the transition of going from one reality of just like this dystopian Berlin club vibe into paradise. all set to the Nightmare on Elm Street soundtrack, just for spirit. But we're not scientists, we're not doctors, but we do know that there's a lot of benefits to coming out of VR when you go into these kind of immersive worlds, and it has a very positive side effect. And that can be really important, and it can also have a very negative side effect, but it's something that we need to be very conscious about within how we're designing this. But this technology and these experiences have an even stronger effect on the brains of children. And children's intuition, like they understand the technology more than we do as adults, so it's very important to have them included in the design process. And when children direct reality, they have different kind of like points of view and desires than us as adults have. Like the Senseless Fairy Tale project is a children's game that we made at the department, and we're like, all right, well, let's make it a gameplay with a traditional kind of like gaming logic of having a conflict that you have to defeat and then you get rewarded and that kind of like sensibility. And we had the kids come in and test it and put on the headsets and try playing around with it. And they were like, yeah, we don't really care about that kind of gaming. We just want to be able to draw. We want to be able to play music. We want to have self-expression environments. And so we kind of guided the project into a world of just allowing the kids to tell us what to do. And it was about making art tools and about making something that they could customize and then almost have that as their takeaway. And so with this project, which is really directed by children, you could see the kind of like motivation.
The Senseless Fairy Tale. This is where we want to be. Buzz the bees. Hooray, they say, the higgledies, boo-boos, and whatnots. Babble Glob is you, the imagination, of imagination, of imaginality fee bigelaroo.
And so it's also like, important to remember that the technology, it wants our soul. Like it needs our soul, and it needs our input. It needs like the heart of child, the soul of man, you know, all of these things. It needs it to feel interesting. So it does have an inherent desire to be interacted with. And this is a project of a puppet that we made that is controlled by the HTC Vive remotes. And we made it so that you could move the HTC Vive remotes like this, and it would control how the puppet like interacts and swings around. And we weren't able to get any good gestures with it, but then we gave it to a musician, and on the first go, she was able to get this kind of beautiful swinging movement from it. And so that's an example of like somebody who didn't know anything about technology, but inherently understood the kind of like dynamics in the system of expression using these remotes. And so with that beauty, we're just like, okay, it works as a tool for being on the stage, but then it's also something to think about, like, what about the audience? What's their perspective with that kind of technology? And what we learned is that sometimes as an audience member, we need to look at technology in a passive way, in a way that we almost don't need to be constantly being yelled at by the device. Like we can see it as an environment kind of thing to like create a nice vibe, because all of these technologies are so mentally demanding that it can be really fretful to be like, oh, you have 55 notifications an hour. And sometimes we need to step it back with the kind of projects that we're making. And so we took inspiration from 70s culture of lying on a shag carpet, being on a couch, making out with somebody, all of these kind of like passive kind of be in the environment chill moments. And we're just like, all right, how can we integrate that kind of environment, but do something that enhances reality with technology? And in that spirit, we created a project called Lava, which uses audio fingerprinting to be able to detect what record's playing, what track is playing, and be able to relay that to specifically designed augmented reality content. And with that content, we were able to use augmented reality in a way where you could just passively look at something and be like, oh wow, this sculpture is growing out of the record player in your shag carpet living room. Hopefully everybody has one. And then you don't have to look at it for the whole duration of the album. You look at it for a little bit, then you go on and do other stuff, and then you go back and then you look at the sculpture again, and it has the same ritual of looking at record album cover sleeves. And so that proved to be kind of like an interesting sort of like rhythm from an audience perspective.
Sometimes my mind, 'cause I know what you don't know, that there is so much to talk about. It seems I am ruled by
And so we learned something about the value of this 70s freedom with technology, and that's really just to embrace the moment and use the technology as a side friend, not as the main piece of focus. But sometimes it is important to give attention to AR. It's not always the case where you want to be passive. And with these nude AR assistants, we were just trying to like think about a way that we can use absurdity and humor to, really grab your attention when it's like something like, all right, here's your workout regimen, here's your calendar, here's your kind of whatever you need to be doing for the day. You can be told by these screaming alien nude AR assistants. And we put that online in the same way that we were doing the speculative vision Instagram posts. And Moncler saw that and they're like, yeah, we love that kind of idea. Can you put clothes on these things? And we ended up being like, okay, well, what are you guys working on now? And they're like, yeah, we're making this book. And we're like, okay, let's talk about how we can use augmented reality to have the clothing appear on top of the book. So we're using like an old digital, or an old analog method of information and infusing it with a digital overlay. And with that, we took a piece from each collection and had just clothing and environment changes react to the book. And there was something nice about the ritual of flipping pages, and that's how you're navigating the different content amongst the augmented reality. So you could flip the book really fast and you could get 8 different pieces of content kind of cycling through. And for some designers, it was more important to show the clothing, and other designers, it was good to show environment effects. But all of this, we use the speculative future vision, beauty, absurdity to give the technology a soul. And you can see in this example of how this is our colleague, who's quite expressive, being able to give attitude to this graphics card from the future that we all want for our gaming projects. And above all of this, we want to use the soul of man to control technology, and with the whole idea to enhance reality. And that's our manifesto of tomorrow from the department. So thank you.